truth blooms where poison.
In the sleepy village of St. Mary Mead, a wealthy baronet is poisoned at Greystone Hall, and suspicion falls on his devoted niece Clara. Was it her inheritance that sealed his fate? Or do darker secrets lurk among the jealous family? Gerald's, debts, Lavinia's pride, Beatrice's hidden love. Enter Miss Jane Marple, whose keen eyes unravel a web of lies, guided by a smudged thumb mark and a deadly garden secret. In this classic Whodunit, truth blooms where poison grows. Will justice prevail before another falls? Chapter 1. The Death at Greystone Hall. The late summer sun cast long shadows over St. Mary Mead, a village where roses bloomed with quiet pride and secrets whispered behind lace curtains. Greystone Hall, a Georgian manor perched on the village's edge, stood as a monument to the Ashford family's faded grandeur. Its ivy-clad walls and mullioned windows spoke of wealth, but on this particular evening, an air of disquiet hung heavier than the scent of honeysuckle. Sir Henry Ashford, a widower of 62, was discovered lifeless in his study just after 7 o'clock. His butler, Matthews, had entered to announce dinner and found his master slumped in a leather armchair, a crystal glass of port tipped over on the mahogany desk, its contents staining a ledger. Matthews, a man of 30 years' service, felt for a pulse, found none, and raised the alarm. The household, comprising Sir Henry's niece, Clara Ashford, his sister-in-law, Mrs. Lavinia Ashford, her son Gerald, and a distant cousin, Miss Beatrice Cole, gathered in the drawing-room, their faces a study in shock and suspicion. Dr. Haydock, the village physician, arrived promptly, his black bag swinging as he strode through the oak-panelled hall. In the study, he bent over Sir Henry, noting the bluish tinge to the lips and a faint, acrid smell. Almonds, but not quite. "Cyanide," he pronounced, straightening. "No question. Death was near instantaneous." He glanced at the spilled port, its ruby stain stark against the desk's polished surface. "Likely in the drink. I'll need to inform the coroner." Word spread swiftly, as it always did in St. Mary Mead. By 8, the news reached Miss Jane Marple, who sat in her cottage parlour, a skein of pale blue wool unravelling in her lap. Her maid, Lily, burst in, apron askew, eyes wide with the thrill of calamity. "Oh, Miss Marple, it's dreadful! Sir Henry's dead, poisoned, they say, at Greystone Hall. And they're pointing fingers at Miss Clara, his niece. Can you imagine?" Miss Marple's knitting needles stilled, their gentle click falling, silent. She adjusted her spectacles, her mild blue eyes sharpening. "Poisoned, you say, Lily? How very shocking! And Miss Clara is suspected." She spoke softly, but her mind was already sifting through the village's tapestry of relationships and resentments. Clara Ashford, a reserved girl of 24, had come to live with her uncle after her parents' death. She was known for her devotion, nursing Sir Henry through a bout of pneumonia the previous winter. Yet devotion, Miss Marple knew, could be a mask for darker motives. "Tell me, Lily," she continued, resuming her knitting with deliberate calm, "what exactly are they saying?" Lily, eager to oblige, recounted the village's chatter. Clara stood to inherit Greystone Hall and Sir Henry's fortune, a fact that had not escaped notice. The glass of port, it seemed, had been poured from a decanter in the study, to which Clara had easy access. Moreover, a bottle of prussic acid used for photographic development had been found in the attic, a detail Inspector Crane, newly arrived from the county police, deemed significant. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene, but her thoughts racing. Prussic acid was a curious choice, swift and merciless, requiring both knowledge and nerve. She recalled Clara's quiet demeanour at the church bazaar, her hands deft with needlework, her conversation polite but guarded. A bottle in the attic, Miss Marple mused aloud. How convenient! And what of the others at Greystone Hall? Lily, warming to her role as informant, leaned forward. Well, there's Mrs. Lavinia, Sir Henry's sister-in-law, ever so grand but sharp as a tack. Her son Gerald, he's a handsome one, but they say he's fond of cards and owes money. Then there's Miss Beatrice, a cousin, always poking about in the garden. Odd she is, with her talk of plants and potions. Lily shivered. Gives me the creeps, that one. Does she now? Miss Marple said, a faint smile touching her lips. She knew the type, spinsters with private passions, their lives a blend of routine and hidden fire. She made a mental note of Beatrice's gardening, recalling that certain plants, like foxglove or monkshood, could yield deadly secrets. As for Gerald, debt was a motive as old as time, and Lavinia's protectiveness might conceal more than maternal pride. The clock on the mantel chimed 8:30, and Miss Marple set her knitting aside. "Thank you, Lily. You've been most helpful. Now, fetch me my shawl. I think a walk to the vicarage might do me good." Lily scurried off, and Miss Marple rose, her slight figure belying the keen intelligence that had unravelled many a village. Mystery. Poison at Greystone Hall was no mere scandal. It was a puzzle, and Miss Marple felt the familiar stir of curiosity, like a breeze rustling the pages of an open book. As she stepped into the cool evening, the lights of Greystone Hall glowed, in the distance a beacon of tragedy. "Poison," she murmured, her breath catching in the air. Such an intimate crime. Someone knew Sir Henry's habits, his trust. She thought of St. Mary Mead's quiet lanes, where every face was familiar, yet every heart held shadows. Whatever truth lay behind Sir Henry's death, Miss Marple was certain it would not remain hidden for long. Chapter 2. The family gathered. The morning after Sir Henry Ashford's death, St. Mary Mead awoke under a sky heavy with the promise of rain. Greystone Hall, its grey stone facade softened by mist, stood as the focal point of the village's murmured speculations. The inquest, hastily arranged, was to be held in the hall's cavernous dining room, a space more accustomed to feasts than inquiries into mortality. By 10 o'clock, the coroner, Mr. Pettigrew, a wiry man with a penchant for precision, had taken his place at the head of the long oak table, flanked by Inspector Crane and a clerk. The household, summoned to give evidence, sat in uneasy silence, their faces etched with varying shades of grief, fear, and calculation. Clara Ashford, Sir Henry's niece, occupied a chair near the window, her hands folded in her lap, her auburn hair neatly pinned. She wore a simple black dress, its severity accentuating her pallor, yet her grey eyes held a quiet resolve that belied the whispers of her guilt. Across from her sat Mrs. Lavinia Ashford, Sir Henry's sister-in-law, a formidable woman of 55, whose erect posture and jet mourning brooch suggested both authority and indignation. Her son, Gerald, lounged beside her, his handsome features marred by a restless air. His fingers drummed a silent rhythm on the table's edge. Miss Beatrice Cole, a distant cousin, perched at the table's far end, her thin frame swathed in a drab shawl, her eyes darting like a bird's as she clutched a worn notebook, its pages likely filled with botanical musings. The villagers, permitted to observe, filled the room's perimeter. Their presence a reminder that, in St. Mary Mead, tragedy was a communal affair. Among them was Miss Jane Marple, invited by her friend Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose connection to the Ashfords granted her a seat near the family. Miss Marple, in her lavender tweed and a hat adorned with a single feather, appeared the picture of benign curiosity, her knitting bag at her feet, yet her mild blue eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing. The tremor in Clara's hands, the tight line of Lavinia's mouth, the way Gerald's gaze flickered toward the door as if plotting escape. Mr. Pettigrew cleared his throat, his voice cutting through the room's low hum. "We are here to ascertain the cause of Sir Henry Ashford's death," he began, adjusting his pince-nez. "Dr. Haydock, if you please." Dr. Haydock, standing with the ease of a man accustomed to authority, recounted his findings. Sir Henry was found deceased at approximately 7 p.m. yesterday. The presence of cyanide was evident from the odour and the condition of the body. Cyanosis, rapid onset. Death occurred within minutes of ingestion, likely via the port he was drinking. He gestured to the glass, now sealed in a police bag, its ruby stain a grim relic. "I estimate the time of death between 6:30 and 7. The coroner nodded, his pen scratching notes. "And the source of the cyanide?" "That remains unclear," Dr. Haydock replied. "A bottle of prussic acid was found in the attic, but its connection to the poison is unconfirmed." A murmur rippled through the room, and Clara's head lifted, her eyes meeting Inspector Crane's. The inspector, a man of middle years with a face like weathered granite, rose to speak. "The bottle in question," he said, his voice clipped, "was discovered in a trunk containing photographic equipment. Miss Clara Ashford had access to the attic, as did others in the household. We are investigating its provenance." Clara's lips parted, but she said nothing, her composure a shield against the room's scrutiny. Miss Marple, observing from her corner, noted the faint flush on Clara's cheeks, a sign not of guilt, but of indignation. She recalled a similar expression on young Emily Trefusis, a girl in the village years ago, wrongly accused of stealing a brooch. Innocence, Miss Marple knew, could wear a defiant face. Mr. Pettigrew turned to the family. "Miss Ashford, please, recount your movements yesterday evening." Clara's voice, when she spoke, was steady, though soft. "I was with my uncle in the drawing-room until 6, discussing a book he'd lent me, Thackeray's Vanity Fair. He seemed in good spirits, though tired. I left to dress for dinner and didn't see him again until Matthews called us." Her voice faltered, and she pressed a handkerchief to her lips. "And the study?" the coroner pressed. "Did you enter it?" "No," Clara said firmly. "I had no reason to. Uncle often worked there alone before dinner." Inspector Crane interjected, his tone probing. "You're aware of the prussic acid in the attic. You studied chemistry at school, did you not?" Clara's eyes narrowed. "I did, years ago, but I've never handled prussic acid, nor seen that bottle before yesterday." The coroner made a note, then turned to Mrs. Lavinia Ashford. "Mrs. Ashford, your account, please." Lavinia's chin lifted, her voice resonant with the assurance of one accustomed to command. "I was in my sitting room from 5 onward, writing letters. Gerald joined me briefly before going to the village. I heard nothing unusual until Matthews's outcry." Her gaze flicked to Clara, and her lips pursed. "My brother-in-law was a trusting man, perhaps too much so." Miss Marple's needles, which had begun their gentle rhythm, paused. Lavinia's words carried an edge, a suggestion of blame aimed at Clara. It was the sort of veiled accusation Miss Marple had heard before, in drawing-rooms and church halls, where envy or fear masqueraded as concern. She glanced at Gerald, whose fingers had stilled, his eyes fixed on his mother with a mixture of loyalty and unease. Gerald's testimony followed, delivered with a practised charm that failed to mask his discomfort. "I was at the Red Lion in the village from 5:30 to nearly 7, he said, his voice smooth. "Had a pint with Tom Barker, the blacksmith. Came back just as the commotion started." He flashed a smile, but it faltered under Inspector Crane's stare. "And your uncle?" the coroner asked. "Did you speak with him?" "Not since lunch," Gerald replied quickly. "He was in one of his moods, kept to himself." Miss Beatrice Cole was called next, her thin hands clutching her notebook as if it were a talisman. "I was in the garden until 6, she said, her voice reedy. "Tending my roses. After that, I read in my room until dinner was called." Her eyes darted to Clara, then away, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it alongside Beatrice's penchant for plants. Roses were harmless, but gardens held other secrets: foxglove, hemlock, monkshood. The coroner, after consulting his notes, delivered his verdict. "Death by poisoning cyanide, administered by person or persons unknown." The inquest adjourned, leaving the household to disperse amid the villagers' whispers. Inspector Crane lingered, his eyes on Clara, while the family retreated to the drawing-room, a space of velvet drapes and ancestral portraits that seemed to watch their every move. Miss Marple, declining Mrs. Bantry's offer of a lift, chose to walk back to her cottage, her mind sifting the morning's revelations. The inquest had clarified little, yet it had illuminated the fault lines within the Ashford family. Clara's position as heiress made her a target, but her calm dignity suggested strength, not deceit. Lavinia's protectiveness of Gerald hinted at a mother's fear, perhaps of her son's weaknesses. Gerald's alibi, so glibly offered, invited scrutiny, while Beatrice's nervous manner and garden obsession raised questions Miss Marple could not yet answer. At the vicarage, where she stopped for tea, Mrs. Bantry was in full flow, her indignation fueled by loyalty to Clara. "It's monstrous, Jane, the way they're hounding that poor girl. Lavinia's behind it, mark my words. She's always resented Clara's place in Henry's heart." Mrs. Bantry, a robust woman with a flair for drama, poured tea with a flourish. "And Gerald, charming, but a wastrel. I wouldn't trust him with a shilling." Miss Marple sipped, her tea, her expression placid. "Lavinia is certainly forceful," she agreed, "but resentment is a common thread in families, isn't it? Like my cousin Fanny's household. Her sister-in-law never forgave her for inheriting the silver." She paused, her eyes twinkling. "And Gerald's charm. It reminds me of young Tommy Pierce, who could talk his way out of anything until he couldn't." Mrs. Bantry laughed, but her curiosity was piqued. "You've got that look, Jane. What are you thinking?" "Oh, nothing definite," Miss Marple said, setting down her cup. "Only that poison is such a personal choice. It requires intimacy, knowledge of habits, access to trust. Someone in that house knew Sir Henry's ways." She glanced out the window, where Greystone Hall loomed through the mist. "And I wonder about that bottle in the attic, so conveniently found." As she left the vicarage, Miss Marple's thoughts turned to the drawing-room at Greystone Hall, where the family had gathered after the inquest. She imagined Lavinia's sharp voice, Gerald's restless pacing, Beatrice's silent observation, and Clara's quiet endurance. Each held a piece of the puzzle, but the picture remained incomplete. Poison, Miss Marple reflected, was not merely a weapon. It was a confession of hatred, fear, or desperation. And in St. Mary Mead, where every face was known, the truth could not hide forever. Chapter 3. The Thumb Mark. The third morning after Sir Henry Ashford's death dawned with a damp chill that seeped into the bones of St. Mary Mead. Greystone Hall, its windows glinting like wary eyes, stood silent, though the village hummed with conjecture. The inquest had left questions dangling like threads from a frayed tapestry, and suspicion, like the mist over the meadows, clung most stubbornly to Clara Ashford. Yet Miss Jane Marple, stepping lightly along the lane to the hall, her black umbrella shielding her from a fitful drizzle, sensed that the truth lay not in the obvious, but in the overlooked. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever a conduit to the Ashford household, had secured Miss Marple's invitation to Greystone Hall under the guise of offering condolences. "They're all on edge, Jane," Dolly had confided over breakfast, her eyes bright with the thrill of intrigue. "Lavinia's practically declared Clara a murderess, and Gerald's skulking about like a cat in a storm. You'll see things. I'd Miss Marple, her lavender scarf knotted neatly, had merely smiled. "People are so revealing when they think they're not being watched," she'd said, and Dolly, knowing her friend's knack for unravelling human nature, pressed no further. At the hall, Matthews, the butler, ushered Miss Marple into the drawing-room where the family was assembled. The air was heavy with the scent of beeswax and old roses, and the fire in the grate did little to dispel the chill of mistrust. Clara stood by a window, her black dress stark against the pale light, her fingers tracing the edge of a curtain. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford sat ramrod straight in a high-backed chair, her morning attire impeccable, her eyes sharp as she surveyed the room. Gerald lounged near the fireplace, one hand in his pocket, his charm dimmed by a nervous twitch at the corner of his mouth. Miss Beatrice Cole, in a faded green dress, sat apart, her hands folded over her ever-present notebook, her thin lips pursed as if guarding a secret. "Miss Marple, how kind of you to call," Lavinia said, her voice smooth but laced with condescension. "We are, as you can imagine, quite overwhelmed." Her glance at Clara was pointed, and Miss Marple noted the girl's slight stiffening, though she did not turn from the window. "My dear Mrs. Ashford," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle, "I could not but offer my sympathies. Sir Henry was so respected." She settled into a chair, her knitting bag at her feet, and produced a pair of needles and a skein of pale grey wool. The soft click of her knitting seemed to ease the room's tension, as if the mundane act tethered them to normalcy. Inspector Crane, who had arrived earlier to pursue inquiries, stood by the door, his notebook open. "I'd like to revisit the evening of Sir Henry's death," he said, his voice cutting through the polite murmur. "Miss Ashford, you mentioned leaving Sir Henry at 6. Did anyone see you after that?" Clara turned, her grey eyes steady. "I went to my room to dress for dinner. The maid, Ellen, brought me hot water at 6:30. She can confirm it." Her voice held no tremor, but Miss Marple saw the effort it cost her, like a young woman in the village years ago, accused of theft, who had faced her accusers with the same quiet dignity. Crane nodded, making a note. "And you, Mr. Ashford?" he asked Gerald, who straightened, his smile forced. "As I said, I was at the Red Lion until nearly 7. Gerald replied, his tone light but strained. "Tom Barker was there, and the barmaid Sally. They'll vouch for me." Crane's eyes narrowed. "We'll check that. And you, Miss Cole?" Beatrice's fingers tightened on her notebook. "I was in my room, reading," she said, her voice thin. "I saw no one until Matthews called us to the study." Her gaze flicked to Clara, then away, and Miss Marple, her needles moving rhythmically, filed the gesture away. Beatrice's unease was not new, but its focus intrigued her. Lavinia interjected, her voice sharp. "Really, Inspector, must we go over this again? My son was in the village, and I was in my sitting room. The question is who had access to that wretched bottle in the attic, and the motive to use it." Her eyes fixed on Clara, who met her, gaze without flinching. Miss Marple, sensing the rising tension, spoke softly. "Might I see the study, Inspector? I've a fancy to understand Sir Henry's last moments. It's such a comfort to picture a loved one at peace." Her request, delivered with the air of a harmless old lady, disarmed Crane, who hesitated, then nodded. "Very well, Miss Marple. Matthews, show her the way." The study was a masculine sanctuary of dark wood and leather, its shelves lined with books on history and law. The desk, where Sir Henry had been found, bore a faint stain from the spilled port, and the crystal decanter, now in police custody, had left a ring on a silver tray. Miss Marple's eyes, sharp behind her spectacles, scanned the room, settling on a smudged mark on the tray's edge. A thumbprint, blurred but distinct, as if someone had gripped it awkwardly. "Curious," she murmured, bending closer. "Not where one would hold a tray to pour." Matthews, hovering nearby, cleared his throat. "The police noticed it, ma'am. They've taken prints from the family for comparison." "Have they?" Miss Marple said, her tone mild. "How thorough!" She straightened, her mind turning to a village legend she'd heard as a girl, of St. Peter, whose miraculous thumb mark had revealed a thief in a medieval tale. Truth leaves traces, she thought, and the phrase lingered, a quiet conviction. Returning to the drawing-room, she found the family still under Crane's scrutiny. He was questioning Clara about a conversation she'd had with Sir Henry days before his death. "He mentioned family secrets," Clara said, her voice low. "He was troubled, said someone close wasn't what they seemed. I thought he meant Gerald's debts, but he wouldn't say more." Gerald's head snapped up, his charm giving way to irritation. "That's rich, Clara. Accusing me to deflect suspicion. Uncle and I had words, yes, about money, but it was nothing serious." His voice carried a defensive edge, and Lavinia's hand rested on his arm, a silent warning. Miss Marple, resuming her knitting, observed the exchange with interest. Gerald's debts were no secret in St. Mary Mead. The vicar's wife had mentioned his losses at cards, repaid by Sir Henry's grudging generosity, but Clara's revelation about family secrets suggested deeper currents, perhaps tied to the thumb mark's mute testimony. As Crane pressed Gerald about his argument with Sir Henry, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Beatrice, who had remained silent, her notebook a shield. "Miss Cole," Miss Marple said, her voice gentle, "you're so fond of your garden. Did Sir Henry share your interest? I recall he admired the roses at the church fete." Beatrice started, her thin face flushing. He liked the grounds, yes, but he left the gardening to me." Her words were clipped, and she opened her notebook as if to dismiss further questions. Miss Marple noted the dirt under her nails, a gardener's badge, and recalled the toxic potential of certain plants. Monkshood, whose roots could yield cyanide in skilled hands. The conversation shifted, and Crane, satisfied for the moment, departed to pursue inquiries in the village. Lavinia rose, her manner dismissive. "We've had enough of this for one day. Miss Marple, you'll excuse us." It was less a request than a command, but Miss Marple, gathering her knitting, offered a serene smile. "Of course, Mrs. Ashford, I'll not intrude further. Clara, my dear, do call if you need a listener." Her eyes met Clara's, conveying a warmth that seemed to bolster the girl's resolve. As Miss Marple walked back to her cottage, the drizzle had ceased, leaving the air sharp with the scent of wet earth. Her mind sifted the morning's observations. The thumb mark, Clara's mention of secrets, Gerald's defensiveness, Beatrice's guarded manner. Each was a fragment, like the pieces of a quilt she'd once helped her niece assemble, requiring patience to form a pattern. At home, Lily, her maid, greeted her with a tray of tea and the latest village gossip. "They're saying Miss Clara's as good as guilty, ma'am," Lily said, her eyes wide. "But I saw her at the post office yesterday, and she looked that sad, not like a murderess." Miss Marple poured her tea, her expression thoughtful. "People see what they expect, Lily, like my nephew's wife, who thought her cook was stealing, only to find the cat was the culprit." She sipped, her mind returning to the thumb mark. Its placement suggested intent, not accident, a clue planted or overlooked, like the smudged initials on a love letter she'd once helped decipher in the village. That afternoon, she visited the church where the vicar, Mr. Clement, was preparing for evensong. "A sad business at Greystone," he said, shaking his head. "Sir Henry was a good man, though private. He mentioned a worry last month, something about the family, but he was vague." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. "Like old Mrs. Harmon, who fretted over her son's friends but wouldn't name them." She paused, then added, "I heard a tale as a girl about St. Peter's thumb mark revealing a thief. Do you know it?" The vicar smiled. "Oh, yes, a medieval fancy. St. Peter's touch exposed a liar's guilt. A charming story." "Charming indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "And useful, perhaps." She left the church, her thoughts circling the study's tray. The thumb mark was no miracle, but it was a signpost, pointing to someone who had handled the tray with purpose. Gerald's argument, Beatrice's plants, Lavinia's protectiveness, all were threads, but the mark was a knot, tying them to the moment of Sir Henry's death. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a soft accompaniment to her reflections. The village was a microcosm, its passions and betrayals as intricate as any city's. She thought of Clara, bearing the weight of suspicion, and of Beatrice, whose garden might hold more than roses. Gerald's debts and Lavinia's loyalty were pieces of the same puzzle, but the thumb mark, like St. Peter's legend, promised revelation. "Truth leaves traces," she murmured, and her needles clicked on, steady as a heartbeat, weaving order from chaos. Chapter 4. The Will and the Motive. The fourth day following Sir Henry Ashford's untimely demise cloaked St. Mary Mead in a persistent drizzle, the sort that dampened spirits as much as it did the cobblestones. Greystone Hall, its grey stone, walls glistening under the wet, seemed to hunker down against the village's ceaseless whispers. The inquest's inconclusive verdict had only fuelled speculation, and Clara Ashford, the late baronet's niece, remained the focal point of suspicion. Yet Miss Jane Marple, navigating the muddy lane to the village hall, her sensible boots splashing softly, was not one to be swayed by gossip. Her mind, sharp as the pins in her knitting bag, was occupied with the thumb mark on the silver tray, and the faint threads of motive beginning to emerge. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever the village's conduit for news, had invited Miss Marple to the reading of Sir Henry's will, an event arranged at Greystone Hall at the behest of Mr. Reginald Thorne, the family solicitor. "It's bound to stir things up, Jane," Dolly had said over tea, her eyes alight with anticipation. "Lavinia's been dropping hints about Clara's inheritance, and Gerald's been sulking like a schoolboy, denied sweets. You'll spot something you always do." Miss Marple had merely nodded, her lavender gloves folded neatly in her lap. "Money," she'd remarked, "has a way of revealing what people try to hide, like my cousin Clara's lodger, who seemed so charming until the rent went missing." At Greystone Hall, the drawing-room was a study in strained civility. The heavy velvet curtains were drawn back, admitting a pallid light that did little to warm the atmosphere. Clara sat near a rosewood table, her black morning dress accentuating her pallor, her hands clasped tightly as if to steady herself. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford occupied a wing-back chair, her posture regal, her mourning brooch glinting like a sentinel. Gerald stood by the fireplace, one hand braced on the mantel, his usual charm replaced by a brooding air. Miss Beatrice Cole, in a drab shawl that seemed to blend with the wallpaper, perched on a sofa's edge, her botanical notebook absent for once, her fingers twisting a handkerchief instead. Mr. Thorne, a bespectacled man with the air of a meticulous clerk, stood at the room's centre, a leather folder open before him. Inspector Crane, present to observe, leaned against a bookcase, his granite-like features unreadable. Miss Marple, seated beside Dolly Bantry, produced her knitting, a soft grey scarf, and began to work, her needle's gentle click a counterpoint to the room's tension. Her presence, unassuming and grandmotherly, seemed to go unnoticed by the family, which suited her perfectly. As she'd once told her nephew Raymond, people spoke freely around an old lady with a ball of wool. Mr. Thorne cleared his throat, his voice dry as the parchment he held. "I have here the last will and testament of Sir Henry Ashford, dated 6 months ago. It is duly signed and witnessed. I shall summarize the key provisions." He adjusted his spectacles and began. "To my niece, Clara Ashford, I bequeath Greystone Hall, its contents and the bulk of my estate, including my investments and savings, to be held in trust until her 25th birthday. A sharp intake of breath came from Lavinia, her lips thinning. Clara's head lifted, her grey eyes wide with surprise, though she said nothing. Miss Marple noted the girl's reaction. Genuine, she thought, like young Lucy Eilesborough's when she'd inherited a modest legacy from an aunt. Inheritance could be a burden as much as a boon, especially under suspicious eyes, Thorne continued. To my sister-in-law, Mrs. Lavinia Ashford, I leave an annual stipend of £500 to be paid from the estate's income for her lifetime. Lavinia's face remained impassive, but her fingers tightened on her chair's arms, a gesture Miss Marple filed away. To my nephew, Gerald Ashford, I bequeath the sum of £2,000 to be paid immediately, and my collection of rare coins. Gerald's jaw clenched, his eyes darkening, and Miss Marple sensed disappointment, perhaps resentment. £2,000 was no trifle, but for a man rumoured to owe thrice that it was a drop in a leaky bucket. To my cousin, Miss Beatrice Cole, Thorne concluded, I leave £1,000 and the use of the cottage on the estates, grounds for her lifetime. Beatrice's head jerked up, her thin face flushing, and she murmured something inaudible. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, caught the flicker of relief in Beatrice's eyes, tempered by something else. Anger, perhaps, or regret. Thorne closed his folder. The remainder of the estate, minor bequests to servants and charities, is detailed here, but these are the principal terms. I will meet with each beneficiary privately to discuss arrangements. He stepped back, and the room exhaled, the silence broken only by the crackle of the fire. Inspector Crane spoke, his voice cutting through the stillness. Miss Ashford, this inheritance gives you considerable motive. The prussic acid in the attic, your knowledge of chemistry from school. Can you explain these? Clara's voice, when she replied, was steady, but laced with weariness. I've said before, Inspector, I never touched that bottle. My chemistry lessons were years ago, and I've no interest in photography. As for the will, I didn't know its terms until now. Her eyes met Crane's, unflinching, and Miss Marple admired her composure, reminiscent of a village girl who'd faced down a false accusation of shoplifting with the same quiet resolve. Lavinia's voice, sharp as a blade, intervened. Really, Clara, must you play the innocent? Henry was far too generous, and you knew it. You were always at his side, whispering in his ear. Her words dripped with accusation, and Gerald shifted, his gaze fixed on the hearth, as if distancing himself from his mother's venom. Miss Marple, her knitting resumed, spoke softly, her tone disarming. Dear me, Mrs. Ashford, families do get heated over wills. I recall my friend Mrs. Price, whose sister-in-law made such a fuss over a teapot, when all along it was the sentiment that mattered. Her words, seemingly innocuous, drew a faint smile from Clara, but Lavinia's expression remained icy. Crane turned to Gerald. Mr. Ashford, £2,000 is a tidy sum, but not enough to clear your debts, I hear. Did you argue with your uncle about money? Gerald's charm flickered, then dimmed. We had words, yes, a week ago. He refused to advance me funds, said I needed to stand on my own, but I didn't kill him for it. His voice carried a defensive edge. and Miss Marple noted the way his hand gripped the mantle, knuckles white. Debt, she knew, could drive men to desperation, as it had young Tommy Pierce, who'd forged a cheque to cover his gambling losses. Beatrice, silent until now, spoke, her voice reedy but firm. Henry was fair. He provided for us all. Her words seemed meant to deflect, but her eyes darted to Clara, and Miss Marple wondered at the undercurrent. Jealousy, perhaps, or a deeper grievance. The meeting dispersed, Thorn retreating to a side room for private consultations, while Crane departed to verify Gerald's alibi. Miss Marple, declining Dolly's offer of a lift, chose to walk to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was hosting a sewing circle. The drizzle had eased, leaving the air fresh with the scent of wet grass, and Miss Marple's mind sifted the morning's revelations. The will had clarified motives. Clara's inheritance made her a target. Gerald's meagre legacy fueled resentment. Lavinia's stipend suggested dependence, and Beatrice's modest bequest hinted at a life tethered to the estate's fringes. At the vicarage, the sewing circle buzzed with talk of Greystone Hall. Mrs. Clement, a kind but gossipy soul, poured tea and leaned forward. "Jane, you were there. Tell us, is it true Clara inherits everything? Poor girl, to be suspected so." Her voice held sympathy, but her eyes gleamed with curiosity. Miss Marple, threading a needle, replied mildly, "The will was read, yes. Clara is the primary beneficiary, but others were provided for. It's like my aunt's estate, where the housekeeper expected a fortune, but got only a brooch." She paused, then added, "Mrs. Ashford mentioned Gerald's debts. Is it true? He's in deep." Mrs. Clement nodded, lowering her voice. "Oh, yes. The vicar heard from Mr. Barker, the blacksmith, that Gerald owes thousands. Cards, horses, you name it. Sir Henry bailed him out before, but last week he refused, and Gerald was furious. 'Stomped out of the Red Lion,' Barker said." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "How like young Mr. Harmon, who quarrelled with his father over money and left home, only to return contrite." Her words were light, but her mind fixed on Gerald's argument, a spark that could have ignited darker impulses. She recalled the thumb mark, its smudged presence a silent witness to the study's secrets. Was it Gerald's, placed in anger, or another's, meant to mislead? As the sewing circle turned to parish matters, Miss Marple's thoughts drifted to Beatrice. The cousin's quiet demeanour and garden obsession nagged at her, like a stitch dropped in a complex pattern. She resolved to visit Greystone's gardens, where answers might lie among the roots and leaves. Plants, she mused, can be as telling as people, like Mrs. Eldridge's foxgloves, which she grew for beauty, but could have killed with a careless brew. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple passed the Red Lion, where a knot of men lingered, their talk of the murder audible. "Clara's the one," a voice said. "All that money, and her with the know-how." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Village gossip was a distorted mirror, reflecting fears more than facts. She thought of Clara, bearing the weight of accusation, and of the thumb mark, a clue that promised to unravel the tangle of motives. At home, Lily greeted her with a tray of scones and the latest rumours. "They're saying Gerald was seen near the study that night, ma'am," she said, her eyes wide. "And Miss Beatrice was muttering about weeds in the family at the grocer's." "Was she?" Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "How curious. like old Miss Finch, who called her nephew a parasite but loved him still. She sipped, her mind weaving the threads, Gerald's debts, Beatrice's cryptic words, Lavinia's protectiveness, Clara's inheritance. The will had laid bare the family's fractures, but the thumb mark, like St. Peter's legend, pointed to a truth yet hidden. Motive, she murmured, is only half the story. Opportunity is the other. As evening fell, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a steady rhythm. The village, with its familiar faces and hidden hearts, was a puzzle she knew well. The will had clarified stakes, but the thumb mark held the key. She thought of St. Peter, whose touch revealed a liar, and smiled faintly. Truth, she said to the empty room, is patient. It waits to be found. Chapter 5. The Garden's Secrets. The 5th day after Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning broke with a tentative sun, its rays piercing the mist that had clung to St. Mary Mead like a shroud. Greystone Hall, its ivy glistening with dew, stood as a silent witness to the village's unrelenting curiosity. The will's reading had sharpened suspicions, with Clara Ashford's inheritance casting her as the prime suspect in the eyes of many, yet Miss Jane Marple, strolling toward the hall's gardens, her straw hat tilted against the light, was not swayed by the tide of opinion. Her thoughts, precise as the stitches in her latest knitting project, turned to the smudged thumb mark and the quiet occurrence of motive rippling beneath the family's polished surface. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose knack for securing invitations rivaled her love of gossip, had arranged for Miss Marple to visit Greystone's grounds, ostensibly to admire Miss Beatrice Cole's renowned roses. "Beatrice is prickly as her thorns, Jane," Dolly had warned over breakfast, her teaspoon clinking against her cup. "But she's devoted to that garden, and Henry indulged her. You'll see something, I know it." Miss Marple, adjusting her lavender shawl, had smiled faintly. "Gardens, Dolly, are like people. They reveal their secrets if you look closely. Like my neighbour Mrs. Price, whose hollyhocks hid a nest of stolen silver." The gardens of Greystone Hall sprawled behind the manor, a patchwork of manicured beds and wilder corners where nature held sway. Roses, in shades of crimson and blush, dominated the central plot, their scent heavy in the morning air. Beyond, a herb garden thrived, its neat rows of lavender, rosemary, and sage bordered by a low stone wall. Miss Marple found Beatrice near, a trellis, her thin frame bent over a cluster of blooms, a pair of secateurs in her gloved hands. Her drab green dress blended with the foliage, and her face, lined and weathered, bore the focus of one for whom plants were both refuge and obsession. "Good morning, Miss Cole," Miss Marple said, her voice soft as the breeze. "Your roses are quite splendid. I heard Sir Henry was fond of them." She paused, her eyes twinkling behind her spectacles. "Did he often join you here?" Beatrice straightened, her secateurs pausing. "Henry appreciated beauty," she said curtly, her eyes narrowing. "But he left the gardening to me, too busy with his books and his favourite." The last word carried a faint bitterness, and Miss Marple noted it, recalling a village spinster who'd spoken of her sister's child with the same veiled resentment. "His favourite?" Miss Marple prompted, her tone one of innocent curiosity. "You mean Clara, I suppose? Such a devoted niece." Beatrice's lips tightened, and she snipped a wilted bloom with unnecessary force. Devoted, yes. Always at his side, playing the dutiful daughter. Some might call it scheming. Her words were sharp, and her hands, though gloved, bore traces of soil, a gardener's mark that Miss Marple found oddly significant. "How interesting," Miss Marple said, stepping closer to the herb garden. "You grow such useful plants. Rosemary for remembrance, lavender for calm. And this, is it monkshood?" She gestured to a patch of tall, hooded flowers, their deep purple striking against the greenery. Her question was casual, but her eyes were keen, watching Beatrice's reaction. Beatrice's hand froze mid-snip, and a flush crept up her neck. "Aconite, yes," she said, her voice tight. "It's ornamental. I keep it for its beauty, nothing more." She turned away, resuming her work, but Miss Marple saw the tremor in her fingers, a telltale sign of unease. Monkshood, she knew, was deadly, its roots capable of yielding a poison akin to cyanide in skilled hands. Like old Mrs. Eldridge, who'd grown foxgloves for their charm, but knew their lethal potential. Beatrice's garden held secrets beyond its blooms. Miss Marple wandered the paths, her sensible shoes crunching on gravel, her mind sifting the morning's encounter. Beatrice's resentment of Clara was palpable, a thread that wove through the family's tensions. The will had left Beatrice a modest legacy, enough to secure her cottage, but not her pride. Had Sir Henry's favouritism toward Clara, as Beatrice saw it, festered into something darker? The monkshood, with its toxic promise, lingered in Mrs. Marple's thoughts, a clue as delicate and dangerous as a spider's web. Returning to the hall, Miss Marple found Clara in the conservatory, a glass-walled haven filled with ferns and orchids. The girl was watering a potted plant, her movements careful, her face drawn. "Miss Marple," she said, managing a smile, "I didn't expect you. Are you fond of gardens?" "Oh, very much," Miss Marple replied, settling onto a wicker chair, her knitting bag at her feet. "Though I confess, I'm more curious about people than plants. You look troubled, my dear. Is it the village talk?" Her tone was gentle, inviting confidence, as she'd done with young Mary Pritchard, who'd confessed a secret love after a similar prompt. Clara set down her watering can, her grey eyes meeting Miss Marple's. "It's everything," she admitted. "The suspicion, the whispers, and Aunt Lavinia. She's convinced I planned it all for the inheritance. Even Beatrice. She called me a usurper last week. Said I'd stolen Uncle's affection." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "I loved him, Miss Marple. He was like a father." Miss Marple's needles began their soft click, a soothing rhythm. "Jealousy is a heavy burden," she said, "like my cousin Fanny's housekeeper, who resented the new maid for winning the mistress's favour. Did Beatrice often speak so?" Clara nodded. "She's always been distant, but lately it's worse. She'd mutter about weeds in the family," staring at me. "And Gerald, he's kind, but he's changed since Uncle refused him money. I heard them arguing the night before." She trailed off, her hands twisting together. "The night before Sir Henry's death?" "Miss Marple," prompted, her voice mild but her mind alert. The argument, mentioned briefly at the inquest, now took on new weight, like a half-forgotten detail in a village scandal that had later proved pivotal. "Yes," Clara said, "in the library. Gerald was asking for a loan, saying he was in trouble. Uncle said he'd had enough, that Gerald needed to face his debts. It got loud, then stopped. I didn't think much of it until now. Her eyes searched Miss Marple's, seeking reassurance. Miss Marple patted her hand. "You've done right to tell me, my dear. Truth is like a garden. It needs tending to bloom." She rose, her mind turning to Gerald's debts, a motive as old as greed itself. The thumb mark, smudged on the silver tray, flickered in her thoughts, its placement suggesting intent. Was it Gerald's, left in a moment of rage, or another's, meant to mislead? As she left the conservatory, Miss Marple encountered Inspector Crane in the hall, his notebook open, his expression grim. "Miss Marple," he said with a nod, "you've been speaking with Miss Ashford. Anything to share?" "Oh, nothing of consequence," she replied, her tone airy. "Just a chat about plants and family, like my niece Mabel, who learned her cousin's secrets over a cup of tea." Her words were vague, but her eyes held a glint, and Crane, though sceptical, let her pass. Miss Marple's next stop was the village shop, where Mrs. Wimpole, the grocer's wife, dispensed news as freely as she did flour. "It's a shame about Miss Clara," Mrs. Wimpole said, weighing apples, "but folks say she had the means. Chemistry and all. And that bottle in the attic, so convenient." "Do they?" Miss Marple said, selecting a tin of biscuits. "How like old Mrs. Harmon's case, when everyone thought the maid took the silver, but it was the gardener's boy." "What else do they say?" Mrs. Wimpole leaned forward, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "Well, Miss Beatrice was here yesterday, buying twine for her plants, muttering about weeds and family rot. Odd, I thought. And Gerald, he was at the Red Lion the night Sir Henry died, but left early, before 7. My nephew saw him heading toward the hall." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her interest piqued. "How curious! Like young Tommy Pierce, who swore he was at the pub, but was caught sneaking home." She paid for her biscuits, her mind filing Gerald's earlier departure alongside Beatrice's cryptic words. The village, with its web of eyes and ears, was a treasure trove of clues, if one knew where to look. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a meeting of the Women's Institute, where the talk inevitably turned to Greystone Hall. Mrs. Price, a stout woman with a penchant for exaggeration, declared, "Clara's guilty as sin, mark my words. All that money, and her with the know-how." But Miss Hartnell, a spinster with a sharp tongue, countered, "Nonsense. Gerald's the one, always in debt, and he quarrelled with Sir Henry. My maid heard it from the hall's cook." Miss Marple, knitting a scarf for the church bazaar, listened without comment, her needles a steady rhythm. The village's theories were a muddle, but they clarified the family's fractures. Gerald's financial straits, Beatrice's resentment, Lavinia's protectiveness. The thumb mark, she mused, was the linchpin, a silent witness to the study's secrets. Its odd placement, near the tray's edge, not its handle, suggested a deliberate act, perhaps to pour or to poison. As the meeting ended, Miss Marple walked to the church, where Mr. Clement, the vicar, was tending the altar flowers. "A sad business at Greystone," he said, snipping a stem. "Sir Henry was troubled lately, mentioned a betrayal in the family. I thought he meant Gerald's debts, but perhaps it was more." "Betrayal," Miss Marple repeated, her eyes thoughtful, like old Miss Finch, who feared her nephew's greed but never named him. Did Sir Henry say anything else? The vicar shook his head. Only that he trusted Clara, called her his anchor. Poor girl, to be suspected so. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling the monk's hood and the thumb mark. St. Peter's legend, with its miraculous mark, lingered in her mind, a reminder that truth left traces, however faint. She left the church, the evening air cool against her face, and resolved to revisit Greystone's study. The tray, with its smudged clue, held answers, and she would not rest until they were hers. At home, Lily greeted her with tea and the latest gossip. "They're saying Miss Beatrice knows poisons, ma'am," she said, her eyes wide. "From her plants, like. And Gerald was seen arguing with Sir Henry in the garden days before." "Were they?" Miss Marple said, pouring her tea. "How like young Mr. Eldridge, whose temper got him into trouble but never to murder." She sipped, her mind weaving the threads. Beatrice's monkshood, Gerald's quarrel, Clara's innocence, the thumb mark's mute testimony. The garden, with its beauty and danger, was a mirror to the family. And Miss Marple, like a gardener tending a delicate bloom, would uncover its secrets in time. Chapter 6. The Alibi Unravelled. The 6th day since Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning dawned with a brittle clarity, the sun casting sharp shadows across St. Mary Mead's dew-soaked lanes. Greystone Hall, its grey stone softened by morning light, stood as a monument to unresolved grief and suspicion. Clara Ashford, though bolstered by Miss Marple's quiet support, remained the village's prime suspect, her inheritance a beacon for gossip. Yet Miss Jane Marple, walking briskly toward the village hall for a parish meeting, her black umbrella tucked under her arm, was not swayed by popular sentiment. Her mind, as precise as the stitches in her latest shawl, lingered on the smudged thumb mark, Beatrice's monk's hood, and the faint discord in Gerald's alibi, each a thread in a tapestry yet to be woven whole. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever a font of village intelligence, had met Miss Marple at her cottage gate, her face alight with fresh news. "Jane, you'll never guess," she'd said, her voice a conspiratorial whisper. "The publican at the Red Lion says Gerald left the pub well before 7 on the night Henry died, not near 7 as he claimed. And Beatrice was seen in the hall's back corridor that evening, not in her room. Things are unravelling." Miss Marple, adjusting her lavender hat, had nodded thoughtfully. "Alibis, Dolly, are like my aunt's lace, lovely until you see the holes. We must look closer. The best village hall, a modest building with whitewashed walls and a sagging roof, buzzed with the parish meeting's preparations. Miss Marple, seated near the back, her knitting bag at her feet, observed the villagers' chatter, which inevitably turned to Greystone Hall. Mrs. Price, a stout matron with a penchant for pronouncements, declared, "Clara's guilty, no doubt. Chemistry. And money. What more do you need?" But Miss Hartnell, a sharp-tongued spinster, countered, "Rubbish. Gerald's the one, debts up to his ears, and that row with Sir Henry. My maid heard it from the hall's footman." Miss Marple's needles clicked softly, her mild blue eyes missing nothing. Gossip, she knew, was a distorted lens, but its fragments often held truth. The meeting, a tedious affair of budgets and bizarre plans, allowed Miss Marple's thoughts to wander. Gerald's alibi, so confidently offered at the inquest, now seemed porous, like young Tommy Pierce's claim of being at choir practice when he'd been pilfering apples. The publican's testimony, if true, placed Gerald near Greystone Hall at the time of Sir Henry's death, a fact that demanded scrutiny. And Beatrice's presence in the back corridor, reported by the hall's scullery maid, according to Dolly, contradicted her claim of solitude. Miss Marple recalled the monk's hood in Beatrice's garden, its toxic roots a silent threat, and the thumb mark, its odd placement a clue yet to be deciphered. After the meeting, Miss Marple visited the Red Lion, ostensibly to inquire about a lost shawl, but in truth to probe Gerald's movements. The publican, Mr. Jarvis, a ruddy man with a knack for detail, was wiping glasses behind the bar. "Oh, aye, Miss Marple," he said, setting down a cloth. "Gerald Ashford was here that night, sure enough. But he left by 6:15, maybe? 6:20. Looked agitated, kept checking his watch. Tom Barker was with him, but he stayed on." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her tone one of polite surprise. "How like my nephew's friend, who swore he was at the cinema, but was seen elsewhere. Was Gerald alone when he left?" Jarvis nodded. "Aye, headed toward the hall, I reckon. Sally, the barmaid, saw him go." He leaned forward, his voice lowering. "Folks say he owed money. Bad sorts, not local. Sir Henry wouldn't pay, they say." Miss Marple thanked him, her mind filing the timeline alongside Gerald's debts, a motive as old as greed itself. As she left the pub, she encountered Inspector Joe Crane, his granite-like features softened by the morning light. "Miss Marple," he said, tipping his hat, "you're about early. Any thoughts on our case?" "Oh, nothing definite," she replied, her voice airy. "Just tidying loose ends, like my cousin Fanny's sewing box. The village is full of stories, isn't it?" Her words were vague, but her eyes held a glint, and Crane, though accustomed to her evasions, sensed she saw more than she said. Miss Marple's next stop was Greystone Hall, where Clara had invited her for tea, a gesture of trust that warmed the old lady's heart. The drawing-room, with its velvet drapes and ancestral portraits, was less tense than before, though the air still carried the weight of unspoken accusations. Clara, in her black dress, poured tea with a steady hand, her grey eyes searching Miss Marple's face. "You've been so kind," she said. "I feel less alone with you here." "My dear," Miss Marple said, accepting a cup, "you're bearing up bravely. Like young Mary Pritchard, who faced a false charge with such grace. Have you remembered anything more about your uncle's worries?" Clara nodded, her voice low. "He was uneasy for weeks. Said someone close was not what they seemed. I thought it was Gerald's debts, but now I wonder. The night he died, I heard him in the study talking to someone, angry, sharp. I couldn't hear who, but it wasn't Gerald. He was at the pub, or so he said." Her words trailed off, and Miss Marple noted the doubt in her tone. A crack in Gerald's alibi that echoed the publican's account. "Talking to someone," Miss Marple repeated, her needles pausing. "How curious. Like old Mrs. Harmon, who overheard her son's secrets but never named the other party. Did you hear anything else?" Clara shook her head. "Only that Uncle said, 'You've gone too far.' Then it went quiet. I didn't think much of it until now." Her hands twisted together, and Miss Marple patted them gently, her mind turning to the study's layout. The back corridor, where Beatrice had been seen, led to the study's side door, a discreet route for a visitor or a killer. As they sipped tea, Mrs. Lavinia Ashford entered, her morning attire as impeccable as her disdain. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice cool, "you're becoming a fixture here. Clara, you mustn't burden our guests with your troubles." Her eyes flicked to her niece, sharp with accusation, and Miss Marple noted the protective edge, as if Lavinia shielded more than her own pride. "Oh, it's no burden," Miss Marple said, her tone disarming. "Young people need a listener, like my niece Mabel, who found comfort in a kind ear. Families are so complex, aren't they?" Her words were light, but her eyes caught Lavinia's slight flinch, a sign of unease that spoke volumes. Lavinia excused herself, and Miss Marple, sensing Clara's fatigue, took her leave. As she passed the back corridor, she paused, noting its proximity to the study and the garden beyond. Beatrice's presence there, reported by the scullery maid, suggested opportunity, if not intent. The monk's hood, the thumb mark, the overheard argument, all were pieces, but the puzzle lacked its central shape. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a knitting circle at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, dispensed tea and gossip with equal zeal. "Jane, you were at Greystone," she said, her eyes bright. "Is it true Gerald's alibi is shaky? My cook heard he left the Red Lion early, and Beatrice was seen near the study that night." "Was she?" Miss Marple said, threading a needle. "How like young Tommy Pierce, whose alibi fell apart when the baker saw him elsewhere. What else do they say?" Mrs. Clement leaned forward. "Well, the hall's maid, Ellen, says Beatrice was carrying a basket that evening, like she'd been in the garden. And Gerald, my nephew saw him near the hall's gates at 6:30, looking furtive. Oh, and Sir Henry was worried about betrayal, the vicar said. Mentioned it at confession, but no names." "Betrayal," Miss Marple murmured, her needles clicking. The word echoed Clara's account, a refrain that tied the family's tensions to Sir Henry's death. She thought of the thumb mark, its smudged presence a silent witness, and of St. Peter's legend, where a mark revealed a liar. Truth, she mused, is like a garden weed. It persists despite efforts to hide it. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the church, where Mr. Clement was polishing the brass. "A sad affair at Greystone," he said, shaking his head. "Sir Henry was troubled, Jane. Spoke of a shadow in the family, someone he trusted but shouldn't. I thought it was Gerald, but he loved Clara like a daughter." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful. "Like old Miss Finch, who feared her nephew's greed but cherished her niece. Did he say more?" The vicar sighed. Only that he'd protect Clara, no matter the cost. Poor man, to die so. Miss Marple nodded, her mind circling the study's secrets. The thumb mark, the monk's hood, Gerald's faltering alibi, Beatrice's corridor sighting, all were clues, but the heart of the matter eluded her. As she left the church, the evening air cool against her face, she resolved to revisit Greystone's study. The tray, with its smudged mark, held answers, and she would find them. At home, Lily greeted her with scones and the latest rumours. "There, saying Beatrice knows poisons, ma'am," she said, her eyes wide. "From her plants, like. And Gerald was seen near the study door, just before Sir Henry died." "Were they?" Miss Marple said, pouring tea. "How like young Mr. Eldridge, whose secrets came out when the milkman talked." She sipped, her mind weaving the threads. Gerald's presence, Beatrice's basket, Clara's innocence, the thumb mark's mute testimony. The alibi's unravelling was a step toward truth, and Miss Marple, like a knitter untangling a knot, would follow it to its end. Chapter 7. The decanter's tale, the 7th day following Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning, ushered in a restless calm over St. Mary Mead, the village stirring under a sky streaked with clouds that promised rain by noon. Greystone Hall, its stone, facade weathered yet proud, stood as the epicentre of whispers that had grown sharper since the will's reading. Clara Ashford, though steadfast in her quiet dignity, bore the weight of suspicion, her inheritance a lightning rod for village conjecture. Yet Miss Jane Marple, making her way to the hall with a basket of jams as a pretext for her visit, was undeterred by the clamour of opinion. Her mind, as keen as the needles in her knitting bag, was fixed on the smudged thumb mark, Gerald's faltering alibi, and the faint scent of monkshood that lingered in her thoughts, each a clue in a puzzle nearing its resolution. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose social manoeuvring rivalled her love of intrigue, had arranged Miss Marple's visit, citing the need to cheer poor Clara. Over tea the previous evening, Dolly had been brimming with news. "Jane, it's positively thrilling," she'd said, her eyes gleaming. "The police tested that thumb mark on the silver tray. It's Gerald's, clear as day. He's squirming, now, I'll bet. And Beatrice, she's been burning papers in her garden, the maid says. Something's afoot." Miss Marple, sipping her chamomile, had nodded thoughtfully. "Marks, Dolly, are like my cousin Fanny's embroidery, meant to be seen, but not always by the right eyes. We must tread carefully." At Greystone Hall, the drawing-room was a tableau of strained civility, its heavy drapes admitting slivers of grey light. Clara sat by a low table, her black morning dress stark against her pale skin, her hands folded as if to anchor herself. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford occupied a high-backed chair, her posture rigid, her mourning brooch a glinting emblem of authority. Gerald stood near a window, his hands in his pockets, his usual charm replaced by a nervous energy that set his foot tapping. Miss Beatrice Cole, in a faded shawl, sat apart, her thin fingers clutching a cup of tea, her eyes darting as if expecting an ambush. Miss Marple, welcomed by Clara with a grateful smile, settled into a chair, her basket of jams placed beside her knitting bag. "Such a kind thought," Clara said, her voice soft but warm. "You've been a comfort, Miss Marple." "Oh, my dear," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "It's the least I can do. Like my niece Mabel, who found solace in small kindnesses during her troubles." She produced her needles and a skein of pale blue wool, the soft click of her knitting easing the room's tension, as if the mundane act tethered them to a world untainted by murder. Inspector Crane, present to follow up on the thumb mark's identification, stood by the fireplace, his notebook open, his granite-like features betraying a flicker of satisfaction. "Mr. Ashford," he began, his voice measured, "we've confirmed the thumb mark on the silver tray in the study is yours. Care to explain how it got there?" Gerald's head snapped up, his face flushing. I handled the tray, yes," he said, his voice strained. "The day before Uncle's death, I poured myself a drink from the decanter. That's all. I swear I didn't touch it the night he died." His words tumbled out, and Miss Marple noted the desperation in his tone, like young Tommy Pierce's when caught with stolen apples, claiming innocence despite the evidence. Crane's eyes narrowed. The mark was near the tray's edge, not the handle, odd for pouring a drink. And your alibi's shaky, Mr. Ashford. The publican says you left the Red Lion by 6:20, plenty of time to reach the hall before 7. Gerald's hands clenched, and Lavinia interjected, her voice sharp. This is outrageous, Inspector. My son is no murderer. He was in the village, as he said. Clara, on the other hand, had every opportunity and motive. Her gaze fixed on her niece, cold and accusing, and Clara's lips parted, though she held her silence. Miss Marple, her needles pausing, spoke softly. Dear me, Mrs. Ashford, families do get heated under strain, like my friend Mrs. Price's household, where accusations flew over a missing brooch, only to find it in a drawer. Her words were disarming, but her eyes caught Lavinia's slight flinch, a sign of nerves beneath her composure. Crane turned to Miss Marple, his tone polite but probing. Miss Marple, you've taken an interest in this case. You saw the study. Any thoughts on the thumb mark? Oh, nothing certain, she replied, her voice airy. Only that marks can mislead, like my cousin Clara's initials on a handkerchief, mistaken for another's. The tray's edge, though, such an odd place for a casual touch. Her words were vague, but her mind was sharp, recalling the thumb mark's placement near the tray's rim, as if someone had gripped it to lift or tilt, not to pour. It suggested intent, perhaps to position the decanter, or to ensure its contents reached Sir Henry's glass. Crane nodded, making a note, then addressed Beatrice. Miss Cole, you were seen in the back corridor near the study that evening, not in your room as you claimed. Care to clarify? Beatrice's cup rattled in its saucer, and her thin face paled. I was fetching a book from the library, she said, her voice reedy. I passed the corridor, that's all. I didn't go near the study. Her eyes darted to Clara, then away, and Miss Marple noted the gesture, filing it alongside Beatrice's monkshood and her cryptic talk of weeds. Miss Marple, sensing an opportunity, leaned forward. Miss Cole, your garden is so impressive. Do you ever distill essences from your plants? I recall Mrs. Eldridge, who made lavender oil, but some plants, like monkshood, have other uses. Her tone was innocent, but her eyes were keen, watching Beatrice's reaction. Beatrice's fingers tightened on her cup, and a flush crept up her neck. I've experimented, yes, she said, her voice tight. For medicinal purposes, nothing more. I'd never harm anyone. Her words were firm, but her eyes betrayed a flicker of fear. And Miss Marple, her needles resuming their rhythm, thought of a village apothecary who'd once concealed poison behind a facade of remedies. The interview ended, Crane departing to pursue further inquiries, and the family dispersed, Lavinia with a curt nod, Gerald with a muttered excuse, Beatrice with a hurried retreat. Clara, lingering, turned to Miss Marple. Thank you for being here, she said. It's as if you see what others miss. Oh, my dear, Miss Marple said, patting her hand. I only watch like an old lady at a window, like my neighbour Mrs. Harmon, who saw her son's secrets in his glances. She rose, her mind turning to the decanter, its smudged tray, a silent witness to the night of Sir Henry's death. Gerald's mark was damning, but its placement nagged at her, a clue that did not quite fit his story. Miss Marple's next stop was the village post office, where Mrs. Blade, the postmistress, dispensed news as readily as stamps. "It's a terrible thing, Miss Marple," she said, sorting letters. "That thumb mark, Gerald's, they say, and him with those debts. My nephew heard he owes thousands to some rough types in London." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, selecting a postcard. "And how like young Mr. Eldridge, whose debts led to such trouble, though never murder. What else do folks say?" Mrs. Blade leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "Well, the Hall's maid, Ellen, says Miss Beatrice was burning papers in her garden, shed yesterday, old letters looked like. And Clara, poor thing, she's been crying, says the grocer's boy. Feels the whole world's against her." Miss Marple thanked her, her mind filing Beatrice's burned papers alongside Gerald's thumb mark and Clara's overheard argument. As she left the post office, she passed the Red Lion, where a knot of men lingered, their talk of the murder audible. "Gerald's done for," one said. "That mark's his, and he was at the Hall." Miss Marple's lips pursed. Village gossip was a muddy stream, but its currents often carried truth. That afternoon, Miss Marple attended a flower show committee meeting at the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was in full flow. "Jane, you were at Greystone," she said, pouring tea. "Is it true about Gerald's thumb mark? And Beatrice burning papers? My cook heard it from the Hall's gardener." "Did she?" Miss Marple said, threading a needle. "How curious! Like young Miss Finch, who burned love letters to hide a scandal. But the truth came out. What else is said?" Mrs. Clement's eyes gleamed. "Well, the vicar says Sir Henry was worried about a family secret, something he'd discovered but wouldn't name. And the Hall's footman saw Gerald near the study door that night, just before 7. Oh, and Clara told the curate she heard her uncle say, 'You've gone too far,' to someone that evening." Miss Marple's needles clicked, her mind weaving the threads: Gerald's presence, Beatrice's papers, Sir Henry's warning, the thumb mark's odd placement. The decanter's tale was one of deception, its smudged clue a deliberate act, perhaps to incriminate or to distract. She thought of St. Peter's thumb mark, a legend of divine revelation, and smiled faintly. "Truth," she mused, "is like a buried seed. It breaks through in time." Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the church, where Mr. Clement was arranging hymnals. "A grim business at Greystone," he said, sighing. "Sir Henry spoke of a shadow in the family, Jane. Said he'd protect Clara, no matter what. I thought it was Gerald's debts, but perhaps it was deeper." "Was it?" Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful. "Like old Mrs. Price, who feared her nephew's greed but loved her niece. Did he say more?" The vicar shook his head, only that he trusted Clara above all. Poor man, to die so. Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling the decanter's tail. The thumb mark, Gerald's faltering alibi, Beatrice's burned papers, Clara's overheard words, all were pieces, but the pattern was emerging. As she left the church, the first drops of rain fell, and she opened her umbrella, resolving to revisit Greystone's study. The tray, with its smudged clue, held the key, and she would unlock it. At home, Lily greeted her with scones and gossip. "They're saying Gerald's thumb mark seals it, ma'am," she said, her eyes wide. "And Miss Beatrice was seen with a vial in her shed," says the milkman. "Was she?" Miss Marple said, pouring tea, How like young Mr. Harmon, whose secrets spilled when the baker talked." She sipped, her mind fixed on the decanter, its tale of betrayal and deception. The thumb mark was no accident, and Miss Marple, like a weaver at her loom, would trace its threads to the truth. Chapter 8. The Jealous Heart. The 8th day since Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning draped St. Mary Mead in a soft haze, the morning sun struggling through a veil of clouds that hinted at an autumnal turn. Greystone Hall, its ivy-clad walls glistening with the remnants of last night's rain, stood as a silent sentinel over the village's ceaseless speculation. Clara Ashford, though buoyed by Miss Jane Marple's quiet encouragement, remained ensnared in a web of suspicion, her inheritance a lightning rod for whispered accusations. Yet Miss Marple, making her way to the village fete with a basket of knitted scarves for the charity stall, was unmoved by the tide of gossip. Her mind, as sharp as the pins in her knitting bag, was piecing together the puzzle of the smudged thumb mark, Gerald's faltering alibi, Beatrice's monkshood, and a new thread: jealousy, a motive as potent as greed or fear. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose enthusiasm for village events matched her nose for intrigue, had insisted Miss Marple attend the fete held on the vicarage lawn. "It's the perfect place to watch them, Jane," Dolly had said over breakfast, her teaspoon clinking with excitement. "The Ashfords will all be there. Clara, Lavinia, Gerald, Beatrice. They can't hide their true selves in a crowd. You'll spot something, I know it." Miss Marple, adjusting her lavender hat, had smiled faintly. "Crowds, Dolly, are like my aunt's quilt. Patchwork on the surface, but the stitches tell the story. I'll keep my eyes open." The vicarage lawn was a riot of colour and noise, with stalls offering jams, cakes, and handmade crafts, and children darting between games of hoopla and coconut shy. The air carried the scent of freshly baked scones, and the faint tang of cider from a nearby tent. Villagers mingled, their chatter a blend of mundane pleasantries and veiled references to Greystone Hall's tragedy. Miss Marple, stationed at the charity stall, her scarves neatly arranged, observed the crowd with the quiet intensity of a birdwatcher. Her mild blue eyes, half hidden behind spectacles, missed nothing. The way Clara lingered at the flower stall, her smile strained. Lavinia's regal sweep through the crowd, her arm linked tightly with Gerald's. Beatrice's solitary figure by the herb display, her thin hands clutching a sprig of rosemary. Clara, in her black mourning dress, stood out like a shadow among the fate's bright hues. She was speaking with the vicar's wife, Mrs. Clement, her head bowed as if seeking solace. Miss Marple noted the girl's composure, a fragile armour against the village's scrutiny, reminiscent of young Mary Pritchard, who'd faced false accusations with the same quiet strength. Nearby, Lavinia and Gerald moved as a unit, Lavinia's voice carrying over the crowd as she praised the Fates organisation, her eyes sharp with calculation. Gerald, his charm dimmed by a restless air, scanned the crowd, his fingers drumming against his thigh. Miss Marple's needles, working a new scarf, clicked softly, a rhythm that steadied her thoughts. Gerald's thumb mark, confirmed by the police, was a damning clue, but its placement, near the tray's edge, not the handle, suggested a purpose beyond a casual paw. Beatrice, isolated by choice, lingered at the herb stall, her faded shawl blending with the greenery. She was examining a pot of lavender, her face a mask of concentration, but her eyes darted toward Clara with a frequency that Miss Marple found telling. Jealousy, she mused, was a slow poison, festering in the heart until it demanded release. She recalled a village tale from her youth, of a spinster who'd loved a man in vain, her bitterness turning to malice when he chose another. Beatrice's resentment of Clara, voiced in cryptic mutterings about weeds and usurpers, echoed that tale, and the monk's hood in her garden added a darker shade to the pattern. Miss Marple's thoughts were interrupted by Mrs. Price, who bustled over with a tray of scones. "Jane, you've heard about Gerald's thumb mark, haven't you?" she said, her voice a stage whisper. "Seals his guilt, if you ask me. And Beatrice, my maid, says she was burning letters in her shed, all secretive. What do you make of it?" "Oh, nothing certain," Miss Marple replied, her tone airy. "Marks and letters can mislead, like my cousin Clara's initials on a shawl, mistaken for another's. But jealousy now, that's a motive worth watching." Her words were light, but her eyes held a glint, and Mrs. Price, sensing a deeper meaning, nodded sagely before moving on. As the fete progressed, Miss Marple slipped away from the stall, her basket in hand, and approached Clara, who was now alone by the flower stall. "My dear," she said, her voice gentle, "you're bearing up so well. Have you seen anything today that troubles you?" Her question, framed as concern, was a probe, as she'd done with young Lucy Iles Barrow, who'd revealed a family secret after a similar prompt. Clara's grey eyes met hers, a flicker of gratitude in their depths. "It's hard, Miss Marple, with everyone watching. Aunt Lavinia, she looks at me as if I'm a criminal. And Beatrice. She stared at me just now, with such hatred, I don't understand it." Her voice trembled, but she steadied it. "Uncle loved me, but it's as if that love is my curse." Miss Marple patted her hand, her touch warm. "Love can stir envy, my dear, like my neighbour Mrs. Harmon's sister, who resented her brother's favourite. Did Beatrice ever speak of her feelings for your uncle?" Clara nodded, her voice low. "Once, months ago, she said Uncle should have married again, that he deserved better than a child's devotion. She meant me, I think. It was so bitter." Her words confirmed Miss Marple's suspicions, painting Beatrice as a woman scorned, her unrequited affection a wound that had festered. Miss Marple's next move was to the herb stall, where Beatrice stood, her thin frame hunched over a display of sage. "Miss Cole," Miss Marple said, her tone one of innocent admiration, "your knowledge of plants is remarkable. I was just telling Mrs. Clement about your monk's hood. So striking, but so dangerous, isn't it?" Her question was casual, but her eyes were keen, watching Beatrice's reaction. Beatrice's hand froze, and a flush crept up her neck. "Dangerous, yes," she said, her voice tight. "But I grow it for beauty, not harm. People misunderstand." Her eyes darted to Clara, then back to the sage, and Miss Marple noted the tremor in her fingers, a sign of nerves that echoed the village apothecary's unease when questioned about his stock. "Misunderstandings are so common," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking, "like my friend Mrs. Eldridge, whose foxgloves were admired until someone mentioned their poison. Knowledge is a responsibility, isn't it?" Her words were gentle, but they struck a chord, and Beatrice's lips pursed, her silence a shield. Miss Marple returned to the charity stall. She spotted Gerald breaking away from Lavinia, his face set as he headed toward the cider tent. She followed at a discreet distance, her basket swinging, her steps those of an old lady enjoying the fete. Gerald, unaware of her presence, ordered a pint and stood alone, his gaze fixed on the horizon. Miss Marple, pausing by a nearby stall, noted the tension in his shoulders, the way his hand gripped the glass. Debt, she knew, could drive a man to desperation, but jealousy of Clara's place in Sir Henry's heart, or of her inheritance, could twist the heart as surely as greed. Turf, feet wound down, and Miss Marple, her scarves sold, made her way to the vicarage for tea with Mrs. Clement. The drawing-room, with its chintz curtains and faded rugs, was a haven of gossip, and Mrs. Clement was in her element. "Jane, you saw the Ashfords," she said, pouring tea. "Gerald looked like a cornered fox, and Beatrice. My maid says she was muttering about justice at the herb stall. What do you think?" "Oh, nothing definite," Miss Marple said, selecting a biscuit. "Jealousy is a curious thing, like my cousin Fanny's housekeeper, who envied the new maid's favour. The thumb mark, though, Gerald's, but so oddly placed, it makes one wonder." Her words were vague, but her mind was sharp, weaving the threads. Gerald's mark, Beatrice's hatred, Clara's overheard argument, Sir Henry's fear of betrayal. Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her eyes bright. "The vicar says Sir Henry was heartbroken, Jane. Said someone he loved had disappointed him, but he wouldn't name them. And the hall's gardener saw Beatrice in her shed late that night, with a vial. Could it be poison?" Miss Marple's needles paused, her thoughts circling the monkshood and the thumb mark. "Could it?" she said, her tone thoughtful. "Like old Miss Finch, who hid her secrets in a locked box, but the key was found. We must wait and see." She sipped her tea, her mind fixed on Beatrice, whose garden held more than beauty, and Gerald, whose mark was a clue that did not quite fit. Leaving the vicarage, Miss Marple walked to the church, where Mr. Clement was tending the altar candles. "A sad affair at Greystone," he said, shaking his head. "Sir Henry spoke of love turned sour, Jane. Said he'd trusted too blindly. I thought it was Gerald, but perhaps it was another." "Was it?" Miss Marple said, her eyes twinkling. "Like Mrs. Price, who loved her nephew but feared his heart. Did he say more?" The vicar sighed. "Only that Clara was his solace, his true heir. Poor man, to die so." Miss Marple nodded, her thoughts circling the jealous heart. The thumb mark, Gerald's debts, Beatrice's vial, Clara's innocence, all were pieces, and the pattern was emerging. As she left the church, the clouds parted, casting a golden light over the village. She thought of St. Peter's thumb mark, a legend of truth revealed, and smiled faintly. "Jealousy," she murmured, "is a poison of the soul, but truth is its antidote." At home, Lily greeted her with tea and the latest rumours. "They're saying Beatrice loved Sir Henry, ma'am," she said, her eyes wide. "Years ago, before he married. And Gerald, he's been asking about Clara's inheritance," says the grocer. "Has he?" Miss Marple said, pouring her tea. "How like young Mr. Eldridge, whose envy led to trouble, but never murder." She sipped, her mind fixed on the jealous heart, its pulse beating through Greystone's tragedy. The thumb mark was no accident, and Miss Marple, like a gardener, pruning a rose, would cut through the thorns to the truth. Chapter 9. The Confession. The 9th day since Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning dawned with a crisp clarity over St. Mary Mead, the village basking in a rare autumnal warmth that belied the chill of unresolved tragedy. Greystone Hall, its stone walls aglow in the morning sun, stood as a monument to secrets that had begun to unravel, thread by delicate thread. Clara Ashford, though fortified by Miss Jane Marple's quiet resolve, remained the target of village suspicion, her inheritance a beacon for whispered accusations. Yet Miss Marple, arranging a tea-gathering at her cottage under the guise of neighbourly solace, was poised to draw the final knot in the tapestry of clues. Her mind, as precise as the stitches in her latest scarf, wove together the smudged thumb, Mark, Gerald's debts, Beatrice's monkshood, and the jealous heart that pulsed beneath the family's facade. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, ever eager to aid Miss Marple's subtle machinations, had helped orchestrate the tea, inviting the Ashford household, with a promise of respite from their grief. "It's brilliant, Jane," Dolly had said the previous evening, her eyes sparkling over a glass of sherry. "They'll come, if only to keep up appearances. Lavinia won't resist a chance to play the grande dame. Gerald will tag along to avoid suspicion, and Beatrice, well, she's too curious to stay away. You'll trap them with your teacups." Miss Marple, adjusting her lavender shawl, had smiled faintly. "Tea, Dolly, is like my aunt's embroidery hoop. It holds everything in place while you work the pattern. We shall see what emerges." Miss Marple's cottage, a quaint haven of chintz curtains and polished oak, was fragrant with the scent of freshly baked scones and Earl Grey. The parlour, with its low ceiling and rose-patterned wallpaper, exuded a deceptive calm, its warmth a contrast to the tension that simmered among the guests. Clara arrived first, her black morning dress softened by a grey scarf, her grey eyes reflecting a mix of gratitude and apprehension. "You've been so kind, Miss Marple," she said, settling into a cushioned chair. "I feel safe here." "Dear," Miss Marple replied, pouring tea with a steady hand. "A cup of tea can work wonders, like my niece Mabel's chats with her old governess. You're among friends." Her words were warm, but her eyes were keen, noting Clara's slight tremor, a sign of strain held at bay. Mrs. Lavinia Ashford swept in next, her morning attire impeccable, her posture as regal as if she were receiving royalty. Gerald followed, his charm frayed by a nervous edge, his eyes darting to the door as if anticipating escape. Miss Beatrice Cole, in a drab shawl that seemed to absorb the light, entered last, her thin hands clutching a handkerchief, her face a mask of guarded reserve. Inspector Crane, invited at Miss Marple's request, stood by the window, his notebook tucked away, but his granite-like features alert. Dolly Bantry, playing the gracious co-host, bustled about with plates of scones, her chatter a deliberate distraction. Miss Marple, seated by the tea-tray, her knitting bag at her feet, opened the gathering with a gentle smile. "It's a comfort to be together," she said, her voice soft but clear. "In times of sorrow, we seek truth, don't we? Like the old tale of St. Peter's thumb mark, which revealed a liar by divine touch." Her words, seemingly nostalgic, carried a weight that silenced the room, and she noted the reactions, Clara's curious tilt of the head, Lavinia's pursed lips, Gerald's sudden stillness, Beatrice's sharp intake of breath. She continued, her needles clicking softly as she took up her scarf. The thumb mark in Sir Henry's study now, that was no miracle, but it spoke plainly. Gerald, dear boy, it was yours, wasn't it? On the silver tray, near the decanter. Her tone was mild, but her eyes fixed on Gerald, who flushed, his hands clenching. "I've said it before," Gerald stammered, his voice strained. "I poured a drink the day before, that's all. I didn't touch it the night he died." His words were fervent, but Miss Marple saw the sweat on his brow, like young Tommy Pierce's when caught with stolen coins, protesting innocence against the evidence. Miss Marple nodded, her expression serene. "Of course, dear, but the mark was oddly placed, not on the handle where one would grip to pour, but on the tray's edge, as if to tilt or move it. A deliberate act, perhaps, to point to you." She paused, her eyes sweeping the room, and Lavinia's hand tightened on her teacup, a flicker of fear in her gaze. Crane, sensing the shift, stepped forward. "Miss Marple, you're suggesting the mark was planted?" "Oh, I suggest nothing," she replied, her tone disarming. "I only observe like an old lady at her window. But marks like motives can mislead. Gerald's debts were no secret, and his argument with Sir Henry, heard by Clara, wasn't it, made him a convenient suspect." She turned to Clara, who nodded, her face pale but composed. "It's true," Clara said, her voice steady. "I heard Uncle and Gerald arguing about money days before, and the night he died he spoke angrily to someone in the study. 'You've gone too far,' he said." But it wasn't Gerald's voice answering. Miss Marple's needles paused, her eyes turning to Beatrice, who sat rigid, her handkerchief twisted in her hands. "Miss Cole," she said, her voice gentle but probing, "you were seen in the back corridor that evening, near the study's side door, with a basket from your garden, and your monk's hood, such a striking plant, but so deadly. Did you distill its essence, perhaps, for medicinal purposes?" Beatrice's cup rattled, and her thin face blanched. I told you, I grow it for beauty," she said, her voice reedy. "I was in the library, not the study. I'd never harm Henry." Her words were defiant, but her eyes betrayed panic, and Miss Marple, her needles resuming their rhythm, thought of a village spinster who'd hidden her malice behind a facade of virtue. Miss Marple leaned forward, her tone soft but relentless. "Jealousy, Miss Cole, is a heavy burden. Sir Henry loved Clara as a daughter, didn't he? But you loved him too, long ago, before he married. His devotion to Clara, it must have stung, like a thorn in the heart. You called her a usurper, said the family had weeds, and those papers you burned in your shed, letters, perhaps, from a time when you hoped." Beatrice's handkerchief fell, and a sob escaped her. "You don't understand," she whispered, her voice breaking. "He was mine once. We walked the gardens, talked of plants of life. But he chose his wife. Then Clara, always Clara. She took everything, his love, his legacy. I couldn't bear it." The room stilled, the air thick with revelation. Crane's hand moved to his notebook, but Miss Marple raised a hand, her eyes fixed on Beatrice. "So you distilled cyanide from your monk's hood," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. "You knew Sir Henry's habits, his evening port poured from the decanter. You slipped into the study through the side door, added the poison, and placed Gerald's thumb mark on the tray, knowing his debts would cast suspicion. A clever plan, but truth, like St. Peter's mark, reveals all. Beatrice collapsed, her sobs filling the parlour. "I didn't mean to kill him," she cried. "I wanted to punish her, Clara. But Henry drank first, and it was too late. I loved him, but he loved her." Her confession, raw and anguished, was a flood breaking a dam, and Clara gasped, her hand to her mouth. Crane stepped forward, his voice firm. "Miss Cole, you'll come with me. We'll need a full statement." He signalled to a constable waiting outside, and Beatrice, trembling, was led away, her shawl trailing like a fallen leaf. Gerald, shaken, spoke, his voice hoarse. I touched the tray, yes, but not to poison. I took a coin from Uncle's desk that night. Petty theft, not murder. I didn't know about the mark." His admission, though shameful, rang true, and Miss Marple nodded, her suspicions confirmed. The thumb mark was Beatrice's trap, not Gerald's crime. Lavinia, her face ashen, rose. "This is monstrous," she said, her voice trembling. "Beatrice, I never imagined." She turned to Clara, her eyes softening. "I was wrong, Clara. Forgive me." Her apology, though stiff, was genuine, and Clara nodded, tears in her eyes. Miss Marple poured fresh tea, her hands steady. "Families are complex, aren't they?" she said, her tone gentle. "Like my cousin Fanny's household, where love and envy tangled until truth cut through. Clara, you're free now, in more ways than one." As the guests departed, Dolly lingered, her eyes wide. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said. "How did you know it was Beatrice?" "Oh, I didn't know," Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. "I only watched like an old lady at a window. Jealousy leaves traces, Dolly, as surely as a thumb mark." She smiled, her mind already turning to her next scarf, the puzzle of Greystone Hall neatly resolved. Chapter 10. The Village Restored. The 10th day following Sir Henry Ashford's poisoning broke over St. Mary Mead with a gentle radiance, the autumn sun casting a golden glow across the village's thatched roofs and hedgerows. Greystone Hall, its stone facade softened by morning light, no longer loomed as a bastion of secrets, but stood as a home poised for renewal. Beatrice Cole's confession, wrung from a heart twisted by jealousy, had lifted the pall of suspicion from Clara Ashford, and the village, though still abuzz with the drama, began to settle into its familiar rhythms. Miss Jane Marple, seated by her cottage window, a cup of tea steaming beside her, surveyed the quiet lane with a contentment tempered by reflection. Her knitting, a soft grey shawl, lay in her lap, its stitches a testament to patience, much like the delicate work of unravelling Greystone's tragedy. The previous day's tea at her cottage, where Beatrice's guilt had been laid bare, lingered in Miss Marple's thoughts. The scene had been as vivid as any village pageant. Clara's quiet relief, Lavinia's chastened silence, Gerald's sheepish admission of petty theft, and Beatrice's anguished sobs as Inspector Crane led her away. The thumb mark, like St. Peter's legendary touch, had pointed to truth, but it was jealousy. Beatrice's unrequited love for Sir Henry, soured by Clara's favoured place, that had woven the fatal thread. Miss Marple sipped her tea, her mild blue eyes tracing the flight of a sparrow. "Human nature," she murmured, "is as predictable as my roses. It blooms, it thorns, it fades. Mrs. Dolly Bantry, whose appetite for village affairs rivaled her love of gardening, arrived at 10, her cheeks flushed with the morning's brisk air. "Jane, you're the talk of St. Mary Mead," she declared, settling into a chintz-covered chair. "They're calling you a miracle worker, solving Sir Henry's murder with a teapot and a smile. Clara's free, Beatrice is in custody, and even Lavinia's humbled. How do you do it?" Her voice held a mix of awe and exasperation, as if Miss Marple's quiet methods defied all logic. Miss Marple smiled, pouring tea for her friend. "Oh, Dolly, there's no miracle in it. I only watch, like an old lady at her window. People are much the same, whether in St. Mary Mead or London. Jealousy, greed, love, they leave traces, like my cousin Fanny's embroidery, where every stitch tells a story." She handed Dolly a cup, her eyes twinkling. Clara's innocence was clear to me from the start, like young Mary Pritchard's, when she was wrongly accused of stealing. It was only a matter of finding the true thread. Dolly leaned forward, her curiosity undimmed. "But Beatrice, how did you know it was her? That monk's hood, those burned letters, her love for Henry, it's like something out of a novel." Miss Marple's needles resumed their soft click, a rhythm as steady as her thoughts. Beatrice's heart betrayed her, Dolly. Her bitterness toward Clara, her talk of weeds, her garden's deadly secrets, they were clues, like Mrs. Eldridge's foxgloves, grown for beauty but capable of harm. And the thumb mark, Gerald's, yes, but placed to mislead, as Beatrice knew his debts would draw suspicion. It reminded me of a village tale about St. Peter's mark revealing a liar. Truth, you see, cannot stay hidden. The village, in the wake of Beatrice's arrest, had begun to heal. Clara, now cleared of suspicion, had returned to Greystone Hall with plans to restore its faded grandeur. Miss Marple had visited her the previous evening, finding the girl in the conservatory, tending orchids with a newfound resolve. "I want to honour Uncle's memory," Clara had said, her grey eyes bright with purpose. "The hall will be a place of light again. Charity events, gardens open to the village. He'd have wanted that." Her words had warmed Miss Marple, who saw in Clara the resilience of youth, like young Lucy Islesbarrow, who'd rebuilt her life after a scandal. Gerald, chastened by his brush with suspicion, had vowed reform. Etish, the police station, where he'd given a statement about his theft of Sir Henry's coin, he'd confided in Crane his intent to settle his debts and seek honest work. "I've been a fool," he'd admitted, his charm tempered by humility. Miss Marple, hearing this from Crane's constable, who'd stopped by for a cup of tea, had nodded approvingly. "Like young Tommy Pierce," she'd said, "who learned his lesson after a pilfered apple. Gerald may yet surprise us." Lavinia, her protective armour cracked by Beatrice's confession, had retreated to her rooms at Greystone Hall, her sharp tongue silenced by remorse. Clara had mentioned during Miss Marple's visit that Lavinia had offered a tentative apology, her voice faltering as she spoke of misjudging her niece. "She's proud," Clara had said, "but she loved Uncle in her way." Miss Marple, reflecting on this, saw echoes of her cousin Clara's sister-in-law, whose envy had masked a deeper loyalty. Families, she knew, were as complex as her knitting patterns, their knots requiring patience to untangle. The village itself, ever resilient, had turned its attention to autumn's routines. Harvest suppers, church bazaars, the first fires of the season. Yet the memory of Greystone's tragedy lingered, a cautionary tale whispered over teacups and garden gates. Miss Marple, walking to the post office that morning, had overheard Mrs. Blade, the postmistress, recounting the case to a customer. "Miss Marple saw it all," she'd said, her voice awed. "That thumb mark, Beatrice's poison, she knew before the police." Miss Marple, selecting a stamp, had smiled faintly, her presence unnoticed. Gossip, she knew, was a distorted mirror, but it reflected the village's need to make sense of chaos. At the post office, Miss Marple lingered, chatting with Mrs. Blade about the weather, her true purpose to glean any lingering rumours. "Folk are relieved, Miss Marple," Mrs. Blade said, sorting letters. "Clara's a good girl, always was, but Beatrice, my nephew saw her in that garden shed nights before, with a vial. We should have known." Her words carried hindsight's clarity, and Miss Marple nodded, her mind recalling the monk's hood's deadly beauty, a clue as subtle as shear-dropped stitch. Leaving the post office, Miss Marple strolled to the vicarage, where Mrs. Clement, the vicar's wife, was preparing for a choir rehearsal. The drawing-room, with its faded rugs and scent of lavender, was a haven of village news, and Mrs. Clement greeted her with a beaming smile. "Jane, you're a marvel," she said, pouring tea. "The whole village is talking. Clara's free, Gerald's turning over a new leaf, and Beatrice— well, who'd have thought? How did you see it?" "Oh, I didn't see," Miss Marple said, selecting a biscuit. "I only listened, like an old lady at a parish meeting." Beatrice's jealousy was there for all to see. Her words, her glances, her garden's secrets. Like my neighbour Mrs. Harmon's sister, whose envy hid a broken heart. The thumb mark was the key, placed to trap Gerald, but it pointed to Beatrice's hand. Her words were gentle, but her eyes held a glint, and Mrs. Clement, sensing the depth beneath, nodded sagely. Mrs. Clement leaned forward, her voice a whisper. "The vicar says Sir Henry knew of Beatrice's feelings years ago. He told him, in confidence, that she'd proposed a match before his marriage, but he refused her kindly. Poor woman, to carry that wound so long." "Did he?" Miss Marple said, her needles clicking. How like old Miss Finch, who loved a man in vain and turned bitter. Love, when thwarted, can twist the soul. Her thoughts turned to Beatrice, now in a cell, her confession a release as much as a reckoning. Jealousy, she mused, was a poison, more deadly than monkshood, its traces etched in every glance Beatrice had cast at Clara. As the rehearsal began, Miss Marple slipped away, her steps leading her to the church, where Mr. Clement was polishing the brass. "A sad affair, Jane," he said, shaking his head. "But you've brought peace to Greystone. Clara's a fine girl, and she'll do Sir Henry proud. Beatrice, though, such a waste of a life." "Indeed," Miss Marple said, her eyes thoughtful. "Like Mrs. Price's nephew, who squandered his gifts but found redemption. Beatrice's heart was her undoing, but Clara's will be Greystone's salvation." She paused, then added, "Sir Henry trusted Clara, didn't he? His anchor, you called her." The vicar nodded. "His very words. He said she was his legacy, his hope. Poor man, to die so, but his faith in her was true." Miss Marple smiled, her thoughts circling the thumb mark, its smudged testimony a bridge to truth. The church, with Its ancient stones and quiet sanctity was a fitting place to reflect on St. Peter's legend, where a mark revealed a liar. "Truth," she murmured, "is a patient gardener. It waits for the right season." Returning home, Miss Marple found Lily, her maid, setting out lunch, her eyes wide with the latest gossip. "They're saying Clara's planning a memorial for Sir Henry, ma'am," she said, slicing bread. "A garden, open to all. And Gerald, he's talking of a job in London, something steady. Miss Beatrice, though, folk pity her, now they know her story." "Do they?" Miss Marple said, settling at the table. "How like young Mr. Eldridge, whose folly was forgiven when his heart was bared. Clara's garden will be a fitting tribute." She ate her soup, her mind at ease. The puzzle of Greystone Hall resolved. The thumb mark, Gerald's reform, Beatrice's confession, Clara's resilience. All were stitches in a pattern now complete. As afternoon faded into evening, Miss Marple sat by her fire, her knitting a soft accompaniment to her reflections. The village, with its familiar faces and hidden depths, was a microcosm of the world, its passions and betrayals as intricate as any city's. She thought of Clara, rebuilding Greystone with hope, and of Beatrice, whose jealous heart had led to ruin. "Human nature," she said to the flickering flames, "is a garden, wild and tame. We tend it as best we can." Lily, bringing a fresh pot of tea, paused at the door. "How do you do it, miss?" she asked, her voice awed. "See what no one else does?" Miss Marple smiled, her needles clicking. "I don't see, Lily. I watch, my dear. People are much the same everywhere." She sipped her tea, the fire's warmth a comfort, and turned her thoughts to the next bazaar, the next pattern, the next truth waiting to bloom in St. Mary Mead.